I can still feel the weight of the knife in my hand from the night everything changed in Sublevel 77 Gamma. Rax Vennor, that was my name when I was still human. 17 years crawling through the Underhive's forgotten tunnels, believing I served the Emperor by collecting scraps for the world above. What a fool I was to think we were anything more than inventory waiting to be processed. The hunger started 3 weeks before the Great Purge, when Supervisor Krantz's morning announcements began, including phrases like resource optimization and population sustainability. We all knew what those words meant in Imperial bureaucracy. Some of us would live, and some of us would feed the living. You want to judge me for what came next? Walk 7 miles down into the dark, breathe recycled air until your lungs burn, and then tell me about morality when your children are starving. This is my testimony of necessary sins. Chapter 1. The Hunger Season. The alarm klaxon echoed through Sublevel 77 Gamma at exactly 0600 Imperial Standard Time, same as it had every day for the past 4 months of what the overseers called resource optimization period. I pulled my grimy rebreather away from my face and spat out the metallic taste that came with breathing recycled air for too long. Around me, 300 other scavengers stirred in their sleep alcoves, each one knowing that today might be the day we stopped pretending there was enough food to go around. My sleep alcove measured exactly 3 feet by 6 feet by 4 feet high. Just enough space for a human body to rest without luxury. The walls were corrugated metal salvaged from ancient industrial equipment, and the smell of unwashed bodies mixed with the perpetual dampness that seeped from the Hive's water reclamation systems. Home sweet home, 7 miles beneath the spires where the real humans lived. I'd been a sanctioned scavenger for Supervisor Krantz's crew since I was 12 years old, when my parents disappeared during one of the spontaneous tunnel collapses that seemed to happen whenever the food riots got too loud. 17 years of crawling through the abandoned sectors, collecting scraps of metal, cloth, and anything else that could be processed into something useful for the Hive above. 17 years of eating protein paste made from sources we weren't allowed to ask about, drinking water that tasted like industrial lubricant, and sleeping in shifts because there weren't enough alcoves for everyone. The Underhive operated on a simple principle. Everything that fell from above belonged to those who could catch it. Food scraps, broken machinery, dead bodies. It all came tumbling down through the massive waste chutes that connected our world to the civilization above. We were the Imperium's digestive system, breaking down waste and extracting anything useful before sending it even deeper into the Hive's foundations. Supervisor Krantz emerged from his private quarters at the end of our dormitory section, his augmented left arm whirring as servo motors adjusted the grip on his shock maul. Where the rest of us were thin from chronic malnutrition, Krantz had maintained the soft bulk that came with access to real food. His supervisor rations included genuine protein, processed vegetables, and even occasional fruit, luxuries that existed only in the dreams of US scavengers. "Attention, workers!" Krantz's amplified voice boomed through the Vox speakers mounted on the dormitory walls. Today marks the beginning of the final resource allocation period. The Administratum has mandated a 47% reduction in Underhive population to optimize tunnel usage and improve air quality for essential personnel. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the constant background hum of the air recyclers seemed to pause as 300 minds processed what we'd just heard. A 47% reduction didn't mean transfers to other sectors or reassignment to surface duties. It meant that nearly half of us were going to die. "Distribution of final meal rations will begin in 1 hour, Krantz continued, his augmented eye scanning the crowd for signs of rebellion. Each worker will receive their allocated nutrition based on productivity assessments and operational necessity. Report to Station Delta for individual evaluation." The crowd began to murmur, a low sound like distant thunder that spoke of desperation and rage. I caught the eye of Micah Tessarian, my work partner for the past 3 years. Her hollow cheeks and sunken eyes reflected the same realization I felt settling in my gut like a cold weight. We were being sorted for slaughter, Mika had been born in the Underhive, third generation of a family that had never seen sunlight. Her grandmother used to tell stories about the old days, when the Underhive had its own markets, its own culture, its own hope. Those days had ended when the Administratum decided that self-sufficient Underhive communities represented a potential security risk. Now we existed only to serve the hive above, and when we stopped being useful, we stopped existing. The next hour passed in a blur of whispered conversations and desperate planning. Some workers talked about hiding in the abandoned sections, hoping to outlast the purge. Others discussed the possibility of revolt, though we all knew how previous uprisings had ended. The smart ones, like old Jerick who'd survived 4 previous optimizations, began identifying which of their friends they could trust and which they couldn't. "The key," Jerick whispered to a small group of us gathered around his alcove, "is understanding that they're not going to waste ammunition on us. Bullets cost money, and we're not worth the expense. It'll be starvation, or gas, or maybe they'll just seal the tunnels and let us sort ourselves out." His words carried the weight of experience. Jerick had been in the Underhive for 43 years, since before the current administrative structure. He'd seen the transformation from a place where people lived to a place where people merely existed. More importantly, he'd learned to think like the overseers, to understand that every decision came down to cost-benefit analysis. "They're going to make us do it ourselves," he continued, his voice barely audible over the distant sound of machinery. "Give us just enough food for some of us to survive, and let nature take its course. The weak die, the strong live, and the Administratum doesn't have to file any termination paperwork." Station Delta occupied a large chamber that had once been a storage depot for the Hive's lower levels. Ancient loading equipment still lined the walls, but the center of the space had been converted into a bureaucratic processing center with tables, weighing stations, and the kind of detailed record-keeping apparatus that the Administratum loved. Supervisor Krantz stood behind the main distribution table, flanked by 2 armed guards whose weapons looked well-maintained and ready for use. The evaluation process was conducted with typical Imperial efficiency. Each scavenger approached the table, submitted to a brief medical scan, answered questions about their work performance and health status, and received their final food allocation. The amounts varied dramatically. Some workers received packages that might last 3 days. Others got rations that wouldn't stretch past the next meal. When my turn came, I stood before Krantz's augmented gaze and felt the weight of 17 years of service being measured against my current usefulness. The medical scanner hummed as it analyzed my body mass, muscle density, and overall health indicators. I knew I was in better condition than most. Years of crawling through tight spaces had kept me lean and strong. But I also knew that health could be a liability if it meant I'd consume more resources while dying. Rax Vennor, Krantz read from his data slate. Age 29, 17 years of service, productivity rating 7.3 out of 10, minor disciplinary infractions but no major violations. Medical scan indicates good muscle mass and respiratory function. He paused, studying something on his display. Allocation. Category C rations, 72-hour sustainability. The package he handed me felt impossibly light. 72 hours of food for a working adult wasn't much, but it was more than many others were receiving. As I walked away from the distribution table, I saw workers who'd gotten packages that might last them 24 hours if they were careful. The message was clear. Some of us were expected to last longer than others, but none of us were expected to last very long. The real horror wasn't the starvation that was coming. We'd all been hungry before, had all learned to survive on less than the human body needed to thrive. The real horror was the math. 300 workers, enough food for maybe 90 worker days of survival, and an administrative mandate that 47% of us needed to disappear. The numbers didn't add up to survival. They added up to a competition where the losers became the meal. Chapter 2. The Mathematics of Desperation. The dormitory that night carried a tension I'd never experienced before, even during the worst of the previous resource shortages. Groups formed and dissolved like oil on water, as workers tried to figure out who they could trust when survival became a zero-sum game. The weak gravitating toward the strong, hoping for protection. The strong calculating whether protection was worth the extra mouths to feed. And somewhere in between, the smart ones like Jarek quietly making preparations that the rest of us didn't want to think about. I found myself sitting with Mika and 3 other long-term scavengers in a corner near the defunct air recycling unit that gave us some privacy from the general population. We'd worked together for years, shared food during the lean times, covered for each other when productivity quotas seemed impossible to meet. But as we looked at each other in the dim light of the emergency illumination strips, we all knew that 17 years of friendship might not be worth 72 hours of food. "They're expecting us to turn on each other," Mika said quietly, her fingers tracing patterns in the rust flakes that covered our makeshift table. "That's why some people got more food than others. They want us to see that survival is possible, but only if we're willing to take it from someone else." Jan Kolos, a heavy-set scavenger who specialized in mechanical salvage, shook his head grimly. "It's worse than that. They want us to do their dirty work for them. Let us kill each other off until the numbers work out, then come back and clean up whatever's left." The logic was horrifyingly sound. The Administratum had mastered the art of efficiency through calculated cruelty. Why waste time and resources conducting a formal population reduction when you could simply create conditions that would achieve the same result through natural selection? All they had to do was ensure that there wasn't enough food to go around, then wait for desperation to do the rest. "How long before it starts?" asked Dex Morvain, the youngest of our group at 19. He'd been working the scavenging crews for only 3 years, and the realization of what was coming was written across his face in the form of barely controlled panic. Jarek's voice drifted over from where he sat with a different group, but his words carried clearly in the relative quiet of the dormitory. 72 hours for the lucky ones. The people who got Category D rations will be desperate by tomorrow night. That's when the mathematics change. Mathematics. In the Underhive, everything eventually came down to numbers. Calories consumed versus calories available. Hours of labor versus units of food earned. People fed versus people that could be fed. For 17 years, those calculations had worked out to a kind of miserable stability where everyone stayed alive, but nobody really lived. Now the equation had been deliberately broken, and the only way to balance it again was through subtraction. I opened my Category C ration package and spread the contents on the table. 3 protein bars that tasted like compressed sawdust mixed with synthetic amino acids. 2 squeeze bulbs of vitamin-fortified water substitute. 1 packet of compressed vegetables that had been dehydrated until they resembled colored cardboard. And a small medical injector containing what the label claimed was essential nutrient supplement, but which everyone knew was a mild stimulant designed to keep workers functional on substandard nutrition. "How long do you think this would actually last?" I asked, gesturing at the meager spread. Jan picked up one of the protein bars and weighed it in his palm. "Maybe 36 hours if you're careful. 48 if you're willing to be hungry the whole time. The water substitute might stretch to 3 days, but you'll be dehydrated and weak." "So the 72-hour rating is based on assuming we don't do any physical labor," Mika observed. "They're expecting us to just sit here and slowly starve while we wait for the population to balance itself out." The realization hit me like a physical blow. The Administratum wasn't just implementing a population reduction. They were implementing a selection process. The workers who could figure out how to extend their food supply, who could organize effectively, who could make the hard choices about resource allocation, those would be the ones who survived to continue serving the Hive. Everyone else would become a cautionary tale about the importance of efficiency. Around the dormitory, I could see the same realization dawning on other groups. The conversations were getting quieter, more intense. People were beginning to look at each other differently, measuring not friendship or years of shared hardship, but caloric value and competition for limited resources. "We need to talk about the obvious thing," Dex said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "About what happens when the food runs out." The silence that followed was deafening. We all knew what he meant. but saying it out loud would make it real in a way that none of us were prepared for. In the Underhive, certain topics were understood, but never discussed. The composition of the protein paste we ate every day, the reason why workers who died of natural causes were processed through the food recycling systems, the fact that survival sometimes required choices that the Imperium's official doctrine would consider abhorrent. Protein is protein, Jerick's voice carried over from his group, as if he'd heard our whispered conversation. The Administratum knows that. They're counting on it. Why do you think they made sure to emphasize that this was the final food distribution? They want us to understand that traditional supply chains have been permanently severed. Jan's hand moved unconsciously to the small utility knife that all scavengers carried for their work. The blade was only 3 inches long and designed for cutting salvage cables, but it was sharp enough for other purposes if necessary. How long before someone makes the decision for all of us? The answer came sooner than any of us expected. A commotion near the far end of the dormitory drew our attention to where Garrett Voss, a scavenger who'd received only Category D rations, was having an increasingly heated argument with Marcus Thane, who'd been fortunate enough to get Category B. "You got enough food for a week," Garrett was saying, his voice carrying the desperate edge that came with genuine hunger. "I got maybe 36 hours if I'm careful. That's not fair distribution. That's a death sentence based on whatever arbitrary criteria they used for evaluation." Marcus clutched his ration package protectively against his chest. "I got better rations because I had better performance ratings. That's how the system works. You want to eat better, you should have worked harder." The logic was perfectly Imperial. Reward efficiency, punish mediocrity, assume that everyone gets exactly what they deserve based on their contribution to the greater good. But in a closed system with insufficient resources, that logic became a justification for murder. "The system is broken," Garrett replied, and there was something in his voice that made everyone in the dormitory stop what they were doing and listen. "The system is designed to make us fight each other instead of questioning why there isn't enough food to go around. They could feed all of us if they wanted to. They're choosing not to." He was right, of course. The Administratum's records showed that the upper levels of the Hive had been increasing their food imports by 23% over the past 6 months, while simultaneously reducing allocations to the Underhive by 31%. The population reduction wasn't happening because resources were genuinely scarce. It was happening because someone had decided that feeding the Underhive wasn't cost-effective anymore. But being right didn't change the mathematics of survival. There still wasn't enough food to go around, regardless of the reasons why. And as Garrett took a step closer to Marcus, his hand moving toward the tool belt where his work knife was clipped, the entire dormitory held its breath. "Easy, Garrett!" Supervisor Krantz's voice boomed through the Vox speakers, though I couldn't see him anywhere in the dormitory. "Resource allocation disputes are handled through proper administrative channels. Any worker who interferes with another worker's lawfully distributed rations will forfeit their own allocation and face immediate disciplinary action." The threat was clear. Start trouble over food, and you lose what little food you have. But the subtext was even clearer. The Administratum was watching, waiting to see how we'd handle the impossible situation they'd created. They wanted data on human behavior under extreme stress, information they could use to optimize future population reductions. Garrett backed away from Marcus, but the damage was done. Everyone in the dormitory now understood that the 72-hour countdown had begun, and that when it ended, the real hunger would start. And hungry people in closed spaces with insufficient resources didn't follow the normal rules of civilization. They followed the only rule that mattered: survive, no matter the cost. As the lights dimmed for the night cycle, I lay in my alcove and listened to the sounds of 300 people trying to fall asleep, while calculating how many of them would still be alive in 3 days. The mathematics of desperation were simple and brutal, but they were mathematics nonetheless, and in the Underhive, the numbers always added up to death. Chapter 3. The First to Fall. I woke to the sound of screaming. The nightmare pierced through the dormitory at 0347 Imperial Standard Time, dragging 300 people from whatever restless sleep they'd managed to find. In the dim emergency lighting, I could see shadows moving at the far end of the dormitory where the commotion was coming from. The screaming stopped abruptly, replaced by a wet sound that every Underhive scavenger recognized but hoped never to hear in the context of human voices. Mika's hand grabbed my arm from the alcove next to mine. "Don't look," she whispered, but it was too late. I was already rolling out of my sleeping space and moving toward the source of the disturbance, driven by the same morbid curiosity that made people slow down to examine vehicle accidents on the surface highways. What I found changed everything. Garrett Voss was dead, his throat opened from ear to ear with what looked like a clean cut from a utility knife. But that wasn't the horrifying part. The horrifying part was what had been done to his body afterward. Someone had been carefully removing select cuts of meat from his thighs and arms, working with the precise efficiency of someone who understood field butchery. The removed flesh had been wrapped in scraps of clean cloth and was nowhere to be seen. Marcus Thane knelt beside the body, his hands and knife covered in blood, his Category B ration package torn open and empty on the floor beside him. When he looked up at the crowd of scavengers who had gathered around the scene, his eyes held the glassy shine of someone who had crossed a line they could never uncross. "He attacked me," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the evidence of what he'd done. "He tried to take my food. I defended myself. That's legal, right? Self-defense?" Supervisor Krantz's voice crackled through the Vox speakers before anyone could answer. "Worker Marcus Thane, report to Station Delta for debriefing and incident documentation. All other workers return to your assigned rest areas immediately. The deceased will be processed according to standard Underhive waste management protocols." The clinical language couldn't disguise what had really happened. Marcus had killed Garrett for his food, then taken the logical next step that everyone had been thinking about, but nobody had been willing to voice. With traditional protein sources permanently cut off, alternative sources had to be considered, and in the Underhive, the most readily available alternative had 2 legs and was getting hungrier by the hour. "This is what they wanted," Jarek's voice came from somewhere behind me in the crowd. "They knew this would happen. That's why they emphasized that this was the final food distribution. They want us to understand that from now on, we're responsible for our own nutrition procurement." The words hung in the air like a toxic gas, spreading through the crowd and poisoning every relationship, every friendship, every alliance that had been built over years of shared hardship. Because once the idea was spoken aloud, it couldn't be unspoken. We were all potential food sources for each other, and we were all potential predators sizing up our next meal. The crowd dispersed with unusual speed, everyone suddenly eager to put distance between themselves and their neighbors. I found myself walking back to my alcove with Mika, both of us keeping our hands visible and our movements slow and non-threatening. The mathematics of survival had just become significantly more complex. "How long do you think Marcus had been planning that?" Mika asked quietly once we were settled back in our sleeping areas. I thought about the question, replaying the scene in my mind, the precision of the cut, the efficiency of the butchery, the way Marcus had prepared his justification in advance. "Since yesterday. Maybe since the moment Krantz announced the population reduction. He knew his Category B rations wouldn't last long enough, so he started planning alternative procurement methods." "Smart," Mika said, and the admiration in her voice made me look at her sharply. "I mean, horrible, but smart. He identified the problem, developed a solution, and implemented it effectively. That's the kind of thinking that keeps people alive down here." She was right, and that was the most terrifying thing about the whole situation. Marcus had done exactly what any rational person would do when faced with insufficient resources and relaxed social constraints. He'd adapted to the new parameters of survival with remarkable efficiency. The Administratum would probably promote him if he lived long enough. The next 18 hours passed in a state of suspended tension that reminded me of the moments before a tunnel collapse, when you could hear the structural supports beginning to fail, but couldn't yet see where the damage would manifest. People moved differently, spoke differently, looked at each other differently. The casual physical contact that was inevitable in the cramped dormitory environment became careful and calculated. Nobody wanted to appear weak, but nobody wanted to appear threatening either. Food consumption patterns changed dramatically. Instead of eating their rations in the common areas where everyone could see what they had, workers began taking their food back to their alcoves for private consumption. People started eating smaller portions to make their supplies last longer, but they also started eating more frequently to maintain their strength in case they needed to defend themselves or pursue alternative nutrition sources. The psychological transformation was even more pronounced than the physical one. Conversations that had once been about work assignments and maintenance issues now focused on resource management and personal security. Workers began forming small groups based not on friendship or work relationships, but on mutual protection agreements and complementary skill sets. "We need to talk about alliance structures," Jan said during one of our whispered conferences near the broken air recycler. "Individual survival is going to be almost impossible, but group survival might be manageable if we're smart about resource pooling and tactical coordination." Dex nodded eagerly, his 19-year-old mind adapting to the new reality with the flexibility that came with youth. 5 people working together can defend more effectively than 5 people working separately, and if we coordinate our ration consumption, we can maintain group strength longer than individual strength. "What about procurement?" Mika asked, using the euphemism that everyone had adopted for activities that couldn't be discussed directly. "Individual procurement is risky and inefficient. Group procurement would be more effective, but it requires trust and coordination." I understood what she was really asking. When it came time to kill someone for food, would we do it as a group? Would we share the responsibility and the resources equally? Would we be able to look each other in the eye afterward and continue functioning as an alliance? "We cross that bridge when we come to it," I said finally. "Right now, we focus on conservation and defense. Procurement only happens if someone else initiates the situation." It was a comfortable lie that let us pretend we weren't actively planning to commit murder and cannibalism, but it was still a lie. Because in the back of all our minds, we were already identifying potential targets and calculating the caloric value of our neighbors. The second incident happened 36 hours after Marcus had killed Garrett, and it involved significantly more planning and coordination than the first. 3 workers from the eastern section of the dormitory, Helena Vasquez, John Merrin, and Tobias Clark, had formed an alliance similar to our own. The difference was that their alliance had run out of food 6 hours earlier and had decided to take decisive action about alternative procurement. Their target was Savlo Hendricks, an elderly scavenger who worked alone and had received Category C rations like myself. Savlo was in his late 50s, moved slowly due to old injuries, and generally kept to himself in a way that made him an ideal victim from a tactical perspective. He was also known for being careful with his resources, which meant he probably still had food remaining when others were starting to run low. The attack was swift and professional. Helena distracted Savlo with questions about his work assignment, while John and Tobias moved into position behind him. The killing blow came from Tobias, a quick thrust to the base of the skull with a salvaged metal rod that penetrated the brainstem and caused immediate death. No screaming, no struggle, no noise that would attract the attention of the guards. What followed was a systematic processing operation that demonstrated considerable advanced planning. The 3 attackers had prepared cutting tools, storage containers, and even a small cooking apparatus made from salvaged heating elements. Within 2 hours, Savlo Hendricks had been completely butchered and processed into meal-sized portions that were carefully divided among the Alliance members. "Efficiency," Jarek observed when news of the incident spread through the dormitory. They understood that procurement without processing is wasteful, and processing without proper distribution leads to internal conflict. Smart planning. Supervisor Krantz's response was tellingly minimal. Worker Savlo Hendricks has been reported missing from his assigned rest area. Any worker with information regarding his whereabouts should report to Station Delta immediately. Standard missing person protocols are now in effect. Missing person protocols, not murder investigation, not criminal incident response, not even waste management procedures. The Administratum was officially pretending that Savlo had simply disappeared, which meant they were giving implicit approval to what everyone knew had really happened. The psychological barrier had been broken twice now, and each breaking made the next one easier. Workers who had been horrified by Marcus's actions 36 hours earlier were now discussing the tactical advantages of coordinated procurement operations. Alliance structures were becoming more sophisticated, with clear hierarchies and role specializations. And most importantly, the list of potential targets was being refined based on observed patterns of weakness and vulnerability. "We have maybe 12 hours before our Category C rations run out completely," I told my alliance during our evening planning session. "After that, we either find alternative procurement or we become procurement for someone else." Mika nodded grimly. The Helena John Tobias alliance has proven that coordinated action is effective. Other groups are going to start following their example. If we wait too long, all the easy targets will be gone. "Easy targets," Dex repeated, testing the phrase. "We're really talking about murdering our co-workers for food." "We're talking about survival," Jan corrected. "The Administratum created this situation. They wanted to see how we'd handle it. We're handling it." As the lights dimmed for another night cycle, I lay in my alcove and tried to calculate how many people would still be alive in the morning. The mathematics were becoming clearer with each incident, and the numbers were dropping faster than even the Administratum's 47% reduction target had projected. But in the Underhive, exceeding quotas had always been considered a sign of efficiency. Chapter 4. The Feast of Necessity. The fourth day began with what Jerick called the sound of mathematics reaching equilibrium. 3 more workers had died during the night, not from starvation, but from the increasingly efficient procurement operations that had become the new normal in Dormitory Block 77 Gamma. The morning count showed 287 workers remaining from the original 300, which meant the population reduction was proceeding ahead of the Administratum's projected timeline. I sat on my alcove bunk, carefully rationing the last quarter of my final protein bar, while calculating caloric intake versus caloric expenditure over the past 72 hours. The numbers were unforgiving. Even with careful conservation, my Category C rations had provided approximately 3,200 calories total. Baseline human metabolic requirements, even with minimal physical activity, demanded roughly 1,800 calories per day. I had been operating on a deficit since the second day, and my body was beginning to show the effects. Muscle weakness, reduced cognitive function, constant hunger pangs, and the peculiar lightheadedness that came with the early stages of starvation. Around me, the other survivors were showing similar symptoms, though some were adapting better than others. The workers who had successfully transitioned to alternative protein sources were noticeably stronger and more alert than those still subsisting on their original rations. "Emergency nutrition meeting," Mika announced quietly, settling beside my alcove with Jan and Dex trailing behind her. "We need to make a decision before someone else makes it for us." The 4 of us had managed our alliance effectively enough to stretch our resources longer than most, but basic biology couldn't be negotiated with indefinitely. Jan, the largest member of our group, was showing the most severe effects of caloric deprivation. His hands shook when he thought nobody was watching, and his usual steady confidence had been replaced by the jittery alertness of someone running on fumes. "Current situation assessment," I said, keeping my voice low enough that neighboring alcoves couldn't overhear. "Rations depleted as of approximately 0200 this morning. No prospect of traditional resupply. Alternative procurement opportunities are decreasing as total population decreases, but competition for remaining opportunities is intensifying." Dex nodded toward the eastern section of the dormitory, where the Helena John Tobias alliance had established what amounted to a small territory. "The successful procurement groups are getting stronger, while the unsuccessful ones are getting weaker. If we wait much longer, we'll be too weak to compete effectively." "Competition," Mika repeated. "We're talking about competing to see who gets to murder and eat our friends." "Former friends," Jan corrected grimly. "Social relationships are a luxury we can't afford anymore. Everyone in this dormitory is either a potential alliance member, a potential threat, or a potential meal. The people who understand that distinction are the ones who are going to survive." The cold logic was undeniable, but it was also horrifying in its implications. 17 years of shared hardship, of covering for each other during difficult assignments, of splitting scarce resources during lean times, all of it had been reduced to a simple calculation of caloric value versus tactical risk. Target selection, I said, forcing myself to think like the predator I was apparently becoming. We need someone isolated, physically vulnerable, and preferably from outside the established alliance structures. Mika pulled out a small piece of salvaged paper and began sketching a rough map of the dormitory layout. Northern section has about 30 individual workers who haven't formed group alliances. Most of them are older or have physical limitations that make them unsuitable for alliance membership. Kira Voss, Dex suggested. 47 years old, chronic respiratory problems from working the deep salvage tunnels. No known close relationships with other workers. She received Category D rations, so she's probably already weakened from hunger. Jan studied the rough map, his augmented survival instincts taking over from whatever remained of his moral compunctions. Good choice from a tactical perspective. Isolated sleeping area, predictable movement patterns, minimal defensive capabilities. But we need to consider the psychological factors too. Meaning that after we do this, we have to live with ourselves and each other. Kira's never done anything wrong except get old and sick in a place where being old and sick is a liability. Can we look at each other tomorrow knowing we killed someone whose only crime was being weak? The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud, poisoning the careful tactical analysis we'd been conducting. Because fundamentally, that was what it came down to. Not whether we could kill someone for food, but whether we could live with the kind of people we'd become after we did it. The Administratum wanted this, I said finally. They created the conditions deliberately. They knew exactly what would happen when they distributed insufficient food, and then monitored our response. We're not becoming monsters. We're becoming what they always planned for us to become. It was a rationalization, but it was also accurate. The population reduction wasn't happening because of resource scarcity or administrative incompetence. It was happening because someone in the upper levels of the Hive had calculated that the Underhive population could be optimized through controlled starvation and managed cannibalism. We were participants in an experiment, not victims of a tragedy. Implementation, Mika said, accepting the inevitability with the same matter-of-fact efficiency she brought to salvage operations. Quick, quiet, and professional. No unnecessary suffering, no waste of usable resources. We do this right, or we don't do it at all. The plan we developed over the next 2 hours was disturbingly sophisticated for 4 people who had never contemplated murder before. Dex would approach Kira during her routine trip to the water reclamation station, engaging her in conversation about work assignments, while Jan and I moved into position. Mika would remain at a distance as lookout and coordination. The killing blow would be swift and precise, targeting the brainstem for immediate incapacitation. Processing would be conducted in an abandoned maintenance chamber 3 levels down from the main dormitory using cutting tools we'd borrowed from the salvage equipment lockers. The meat would be divided into meal-sized portions for even distribution, with careful attention to maintaining group caloric balance. Inedible remains would be disposed of through the waste reclamation chutes, following the same protocols used for industrial debris. One more thing, Jan said as we finalized the details. After this is done, we don't talk about it. We don't discuss it. We don't reference it. We don't acknowledge it happened. It becomes part of the background reality, like the recycled air and the emergency lighting. Something that exists, but doesn't need to be mentioned. The psychological protection strategy made sense. If we were going to maintain functional relationships after crossing this particular moral boundary, we needed to compartmentalize the experience in a way that would allow normal social interaction to continue. The alternative was complete psychological breakdown, which would serve nobody's survival interests. Kira Voss died at 1347 Imperial Standard Time, approximately 18 minutes after beginning her routine afternoon walk to the water reclamation station. Dex's distraction technique worked perfectly, engaging her in a detailed conversation about the proper maintenance procedures for tunnel support structures, while Jan approached from behind with a salvaged metal spike. The killing blow was clean and professional, penetrating the base of her skull and severing the brainstem connection in a way that caused immediate unconsciousness and death within seconds. No screaming, no struggle, no evidence of suffering beyond the momentary surprise that flickered across her face when she realized what was happening. What followed was 3 hours of systematic butchery that none of us had expected to be so routine. The human body, when approached with the same mindset used for processing mechanical salvage, proved to be remarkably straightforward to disassemble. Meat separated cleanly from bone along natural anatomical boundaries. Usable protein could be efficiently extracted and prepared for consumption with minimal waste. The psychological detachment required for the work was easier to achieve than I'd anticipated. By focusing on the technical aspects of the task, proper knife angles, optimal cutting sequences, efficient packaging methods, it was possible to avoid thinking about the fact that 6 hours earlier, the components we were processing had been a person with thoughts and feelings and hopes for survival. Approximately 43 pounds of usable protein, Mika announced as we completed the inventory of our procurement operation. Properly rationed, that's enough to sustain our alliance for approximately 12 days at minimal activity levels. 12 days. In the context of our previous 72-hour supply horizon, 12 days represented unimaginable abundance. We had successfully solved our immediate nutritional crisis while positioning ourselves among the stronger surviving groups in the dormitory population. The meat itself tasted better than I'd expected, though that might have been due to the contrast with the synthetic protein paste we'd been subsisting on for years. Properly prepared over one of the improvised cooking elements, seasoned with salvaged spice packets from old meal rations, and consumed by people who hadn't had adequate nutrition in 4 days, Kiravos proved to be remarkably satisfying from a purely gastronomic perspective. "Not bad," Dex observed quietly as we shared our first real meal in days. "Different texture than the synthetic stuff, but the flavor is actually pretty good." "Protein is protein," Jan agreed, echoing Jarek's earlier observation. "The source is less important than the nutritional value. We're maintaining our strength, which means we're maintaining our survival prospects." As evening approached and the dormitory settled into another tense night cycle, I took inventory of our transformed situation. 4 days earlier, we'd been desperate scavengers facing certain death from administrative population reduction. Now, we were well-fed predators with sufficient resources to outlast most of our potential competitors. The metamorphosis was complete. We were no longer the people we'd been at the beginning of the week, and we could never go back to being those people again. But we were alive, we were strong, and we were adapting successfully to the new parameters of existence in the Underhive. Supervisor Krantz's evening announcement confirmed what we all understood. Worker population optimization proceeding ahead of projected timelines. Current census indicates 267 remaining personnel, representing approximately 89% efficiency compared to administrative targets. Continued monitoring protocols remain in effect. 89% efficiency toward a 47% population reduction meant that the Administratum's experiment was succeeding beyond their projections. The Underhive workers were proving remarkably adaptable when proper incentives were applied. And in the grim mathematics of Imperial administration, adaptability was always considered a positive trait. As I settled into my alcove for another night of carefully guarded sleep, I reflected on the strange satisfaction that came with successful problem solving. We'd faced an impossible situation and found a workable solution. We'd adapted to new circumstances with efficiency and professionalism. We'd proven ourselves worthy of survival according to the only criteria that mattered. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new calculations about resource management and tactical positioning. But tonight, for the first time in days, I fell asleep with a full stomach and the confidence that came with knowing I was among the predators rather than the prey. In the Underhive, that counted as victory.